Hey, with you Evening Story Channel, I post new interesting stories every day. Subscribe and click the bell to not miss it.
Jack was not a street kid in the full sense of the word, but he grew up like a roadside weed. The eternally drunken mother did not look after her summer son at all, and the boy from the earliest years had to survive as God would allow, so he wouldn't interfere with his mother's time with drinking buddies. She put him out the door and locked the apartment from the inside, often forgetting to take the door away. Then Jack would spend the night in the pavilion of the kindergarten, sneaking in through the bars of the fence. There were cozy little sofas there, and there was always something to cover himself with. And if the watchman saw him and kicked him out of there, he could sleep in the entrance under the stairs or went to the neighboring entrance to a familiar grandmother, Adriana, who took pity on him and often fed him something tasty. But the grandmother herself lived very poorly. Jack saw it all understood as an adult. And he tried to bother her as little as possible. Sometimes, when he was hungry, he would go to a small store nearby, sit on a bench, and wait for someone to give him a gingerbread, candy, or cookies. Jack never begged, never begged, never begged. He didn't pester passersby, trying to mollify them with the story of his hard life. He would just stare in such a way that people realized that the boy was very hungry. But not everyone tried to do anything to help the little boy. Many, on the contrary, lowered their eyes and hurriedly passed by. But there were others who were kind. Sometimes, even someone went back to the store, bought a pack of cookies, a loaf, bread, or cheap gingerbread. Jack thanked them heartily for it. He would hide it in his pocket and rush to his grandmother to eat it all together with her. Only in reality, it happened very rarely. But Jack never took money. He thought that only beggars do that, and he didn't want to be like them. One morning, Jack was sitting outside the store when he saw a young woman in a dark blue dress. She looked at the boy and smiled at him, and he thought he had never seen a woman with such a kind face. He smiled at her too, and then she disappeared into the store. She came out about 10 minutes later and went straight to Jack and handed him a package. "Hey, baby, here's some happiness for you. What's your name?" asked the kind stranger. Jack did not answer. He looked at the bag, which contained 2 loaves of sausage, bread, a bag of juice, candy. "What's your name, Jack?" "Well, you're welcome to eat." The woman stroked Jack's long, uncut head. Then she headed for the car she'd come in. The boy looked after her, clutching the precious gift in his hands. Suddenly, he realized that he hadn't even thanked the kind woman. He ran after her. "Thank you. Thank you very much." Tears showed in the boy's eyes. "Yes, you are welcome, Jack," replied the woman and smiled at him again. "And just don't cry. Everything will be fine. Everything will definitely be fine at Vanya's." She left, and the boy stood by the roadside for a long time, thinking that he would very much like his mother to be like this very woman. The heavy package pulled away from his hands, and Jack hurried to say, "Today they're going to have a real feast." That's how excited she'll be. They eat sandwiches first. Grandma Adriana greeted her little friend with a smile. "Jack, where have you been for so long? I've been waiting for you, Jack. Come on in." "Hurry up, I've made some soup." Jack proudly walked into the kitchen and began to put out of his bag of food directly on the table. "Look, Granny, what I have is all for you and me." The old lady frowned, shook her head. "Jack, how many times have I told you not to go to the store? It's very bad to beg. Come to me more often, we'll get by somehow. You're small, I'm old. Do we need a lot for the 2 of us?" "No, Grandma, I never beg. People give it to me." Grandma Adriana looked at the groceries and then at the boy. "Everything here is so expensive. Jack, you didn't steal it. Remember, if you steal, I won't be friends with you, and I won't talk to you either. Stealing is the last thing you do. Come on, Grandma. I don't steal. I'll never steal in my life." The boy climbed up on a chair and, watching the old woman pouring soup on plates, told her about the kind woman who bought him so many delicious things. "Really, it's good that I met her," dangling his feet, and asked him, "Of course, my boy, may you meet only good people in your life, and God bless her for taking pity on you." Adriana's grandmother sighed, to which Mom and I waved my hand. "Boy with appetite, bread happens hot soup. She now has an uncle. Tolia lives. He's so girly. I don't want to go there at all." "Oh, you orphan in mine. Where will I go?" "Rain, I'm sorry. My blood pressure's been so high lately," she complained, And you, Grandmother Adriana, do not go anywhere. Wait, I'll grow up soon, I'll be a doctor and I'll cure you." Grandma sighed again and furtively wiped away her tears. She had always felt sorry for Jack. His mother had always felt sorry for him. But what kind of a boy had she gotten? Who was his father? She didn't know. She used to go 3 days without a drink, tidy up the apartment, cook a meal. But for the last couple of years, she'd barely been sober. He was the only one I could give a shit about, how Jack grew up so smart. And he wasn't even 6 years old yet. Adriana's grandmother wished she had a grandson like him. She wasn't really alone. Her daughters lived somewhere, but they all had their own families. No one remembered the right one in her, and only that fierce little boy of theirs with the dark cherry eyes became her troop in the last years. Every time they met, he would tell his grandmother how his day was, and then listen attentively to what she said. Sometimes they would have lunch or dinner together. And Grandmother Adriana noticed that Jack was most willing to sit down at the table when he himself came not empty-handed. Now he was happily eating his soup, and she would slip him bits of sausage and eat with him herself. When Jack went with his portion, he waited patiently for his grandmother to pour tea and divide into pieces that gray thing with the funny name of halva. It was getting dark outside when Jack walked up to his apartment, tried to open it, and realized the door was unlocked. His mother and her drinking buddies were asleep, and Jack, trying not to wake them quietly, snuck into his room. Don't get undressed. He crawled under the old blanket, from which pieces of loose absorbent cotton were sticking out in all directions. And for the first time in a long time, he fell asleep, truly satiated. A couple of days later, Jack came in again and sat down on his bench outside the store. Suddenly, a woman came out of the door with 2 bags and a disabled cane in her hands. One awkward movement, and the cane fell out of her hands. The woman turned around confused, not knowing how to get down the steps. Jack, there was no need to explain. He ran up and handed the woman the cane, and then offered his help. She looked incredulously at such an unreliable helper, but hesitated briefly and let the little boy take 1 bag. The jack was very heavy, stretched handles, cut fingers, but the boy endured. Good. At least the children are not far away at all, and Jack breathed a sigh of relief when he put the bag at the door of the women's house. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done without you," she thanked him. "Tired." "Not at all." "Goodbye." Jack waved goodbye and sprinted for the door, but the woman called out to him, Wait, where are you going?" "Come here." The boy turned around. When he saw in the woman's hands $5, which she held out, he stepped back and desperately shook his head. That's more of the woman's anger. "Are you going to argue with me?" And already softer added, "Take it and take it. This is your first earnings in this life. You should be proud, but you're waving your head around." And she shoved the money into the kid's hands. Jack was over the moon. That's how happy his grandmother would be, praising him. He went to the store and bought 2 handy buns and a carton of milk. He did not go to his grandmother. He flew without feeling the ground under him, but suddenly stopped abruptly near the entrance of an ambulance. Jack looked at it and suddenly felt something wrong. Quietly, he began to climb the stairs. The door to Grandma Adriana's apartment was open. There were neighbors standing in the rooms. Jack easily squeezed through among them and saw that the grandmother is lying motionless on the bed, and next to the doctor sits and writes something. She's sick, very sick. They'll probably take her to the hospital. Her blood pressure was beating in the little boy's brain. But then Aunt Betty, who lived across the street from the grandmother, saw it, slammed it down, and brought the boy's head to her. "Well, Jack, your grandma's dead." "Ooh, you're a bitter grief." Jack broke out of the hands of Aunt Faith and looked at her wildly, and then desperately shook his head. Then suddenly he shouted angrily, "No, you're all lying because..." All around him sued on it, and Jack ran out of the apartment. But then his legs went under him, and he sank down on the steps. The boy sat motionless for a long time. He saw his grandmother being carried out on a stretcher. Then her Aunt Betty's apartment was closed, and she went to her apartment. And he kept sitting there, clutching a crumpled needle and a carton of milk in his hands. 2 days later, there was a funeral. Faith's grandmother's daughters came from far away. Again, her apartment was crowded, but Jack did not go there. He looked from the side at everything that was happening and clenched his cheeks tightly with his hands, afraid not to hold back, and burst into tears in front of everyone. Then he saw his grandmother Adriana off with everyone to the cemetery. It wasn't very far away, just a few blocks. And Jack remembered the way well. It was fall. If it wasn't raining, Jack would go to his grandmother's house, look at her portrait, and tell her everything that happened to him. Then he would go home. When winter came, Jack did not visit his grandmother. The roads were snowed over, and he had no warm clothes or warm shoes. After going outside a couple times, he got a bad cold and was sick for almost 3 months. And then a new misfortune happened. His mother was gone. Jack was not at home at that time. He was in the hospital with pneumonia. Aunt Betty called the doctors for him. She once saw him sitting on the steps and realized that the child is very bad. Betty visited Jack several times and brought him warm clothes. She came to pick him up herself at the discharge. "Listen to me, Jack," she said to him. "Your mom is dead. We buried her, and people will come to see you. They're kind. There's a place called a foster home. They'll take you with them. You'll live there. Aunt Betty from the bakery. Would I take you in, Jack? But you know I'm always at work, and my mom's old and sick all the time, and Peter's been drinking. Your mom won't like it here, and no one will give you to us." "I understand," Jack said calmly, and looked at the woman with an unexpectedly mature look. She couldn't stand it and cried out again, wondering what this child, who hadn't even begun to live, was going through. He saw her tears and stroked her hand. "Don't cry, I guess. I'll be fine there. I have to go to school soon. I turned 6 the day before yesterday. How am I doing?" After spending some time at Auntie Faith's and winning, Jack, the familiar darling, went to his grandmother's house. He had so much to tell her. His mother was buried nearby, but the boy stood over her grave, went and sat down with his grandmother for a little while. He said something to her with anxious sobs, and did not hear at all how a tall, well-dressed man came up to him from behind. "Oh, great. What are you doing here? Alone?" The man sat down next to Jack and looked into his tear-filled eyes. And suddenly the child, breaking all the dams in his soul, burst into tears and told him everything about his bitter life. The man covered his eyes with his hand, listening to the boy, and then said in a strangely even voice, "You know, my wife and I had a son once too, but he died right after he was born. We didn't even get to hold him in our arms. It happened exactly 5 years ago." The man was silent for a while, then he continued, "I came to check on him. His grave is nearby. My wife should arrive soon. We agreed to meet her here. She's a very good and kind woman. You'll meet her now and see for yourself. Say, Jack, would you like to be our second son?" Jack lifted his crying face and looked at him. "I do. Can I?" Suddenly a woman appeared on the path, and Jack recognized her at once. She, on seeing her husband with some child, hurried closer and immediately exclaimed to Jack, "This one. I've been looking for you. James, this is the same boy I told you about." Jack smiled sadly. He remembered the taste of the sausage, the hollandaise, that she had once given him. He remembered his grandmother, and tears flowed down his cheeks again. But they were his last tears. "Kelly, let's stop Jack. He's got no one." "Kelly, hug the boy. Will you let us be parents to you?" she asked, and when he nodded, she held him close to her. "You just don't cry. Everything's gonna be okay now, I promised you." A few years passed. Jack brought happiness to James and Kelly. A year later, James' small firm began to gain momentum and grew into a large company. And Olga got pregnant again and gave birth to twin girls who did not care about their older brother. Jack grew up and became the best doctor in town. On the door of his office, it was written on the door of the office of a doctor of the highest category, Therapist James.